This is video 3 of Tell Me More, and we are looking at the required and specifically the second required. So we are still busy with discuss the recognition of revenue from a very specific contract option, the TEL 1010 plus contract option, in terms of the following steps, and which step in the revenue recognition process are we going to deal with in the second required. It is to allocate the transaction price to the performance obligations in the contract. Again, look specifically at the note, because we try and limit your discussion. We try and narrow it down because IFRS 15 is so wide. And we say note, do not define transaction price. Also look at the mark allocation and therefore the time allocation as a guideline of how much you need to write. If we have a look at the solution, we start with paragraph 73 out of IFRS 15 that says the objective when you allocate transaction price to the performance obligations is to get the amount of consideration to which the entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring the promised goods or services to the customer. Then we go to paragraph 74 and it says, in meeting this objective, to meet that objective, you should allocate the transaction price to each performance obligation on a relative stand-alone selling price basis. Paragraph 76 then says, to allocate the transaction price to the performance obligation on a standalone selling price basis, you need to estimate, you need to determine the standalone selling price at contract inception. And then paragraph 77 says, what is the standalone selling price? So you can see here that each paragraph sort of refers to the next. They all work together to help you get to the answer. So if you remember back to the first part of the required in this question, there were two performance obligations. There was the router and the internet service. So our transaction price will need to be allocated to the two performance obligations, the router and the internet service, based on the standalone selling prices of each. But we first need to now go and see what is a standalone selling price. So a standalone selling price is the price at which an entity would sell a promised good or service separately to a customer. And the best evidence of a standalone selling price is the observable price of a good or service when the entity sells that goods or service separately in similar circumstances and to similar customers. So if we take it back to this specific question and we apply the information in the question, the standalone selling price of the router is $1,299 because that would be the price if TellMeMore sold the router not as part of a data package all on its own to a customer. That is what it would cost. The standalone selling price of the internet service is $575 per month for 12 months. How do we know that? Well, if you do not take a router and you only take the internet service, that is what you would pay. So that is standalone for this specific performance obligation. A paragraph that you might have noticed as you now go through the paragraphs dealing with transaction price and allocating it to the performance obligations is paragraph 81 that deals with a discount. Now, the word discount was not specifically mentioned in the question. It wasn't said that the customer receives a discount, but paragraph 81 says, a customer receives a discount for purchasing a bundle of goods or services if the sum of the standalone selling prices of those promised goods or services in the contract exceeds the promised consideration in the contract. And then they go on and they say, sometimes you would allocate the discount only to one specific performance obligation, but that has to be very specifically mentioned. Otherwise, you will allocate the discount to all the performance obligations. So now we need to go and sort of test, is there a discount in this specific contract? They didn't explicitly say it in the given information, but is there maybe a discount? So if we go have a look, the sum of the standalone selling prices. So we know what the standalone selling prices are. For the router, it is 1,299 Rand, and for the internet service, it is 575 times 12 months. So the total standalone selling prices is 8,199. What is the promised consideration in the contract? You would enter into this contract at 649 Rand per month over 12 months. That answer is less than the sum of the standalone selling prices, which means there is a discount because you entered into a contract, a data contract, and you received the router when entering into this data contract. There is a discount in the contract. So now we have to go and take the discount into account as well and allocate that discount proportionately or in a ratio to all the performance obligations when we allocate the transaction price. So we have two performance obligations. It is the router and the internet service. We know what their standalone selling prices are, and we also know what the total promised consideration is in this contract. So now we go and we allocate the consideration to each of the performance obligations. How do we do that? Based on their standalone selling prices. So it's a ratio that you do. So for the router, you take the standalone selling price of the router, you divide that by the sum total of all the standalone selling prices, and then you multiply that by the consideration to get the portion of the consideration specific to the router. So you do the same for the internet service. You take the standalone selling price of the internet service divided by the total of all the standalone selling prices so that you can get a proportion or a ratio. Multiply that with the total consideration so that you know which part of the consideration specifically needs to be allocated to this performance obligation.